we are only about 45 minutes late, behind schedule. But I would say this morning was really inspiring, and I think not often that you hear so much good news in one forenoon. So it's really wonderful. I think both what we heard from all the speakers this morning, about the report, and the possibilities, I think, that have been highlighted. So since we are behind time, I mean, I'm going to cut out a lot of the protocol for salutations, greetings and all. It's wonderful to be on this panel. It's wonderful to have the two ambassadors and High Commissioner here. So it's really a good moment to reflect on what we're doing. So I thought I would just limit myself to three broad points. I think one, what was surprising for someone my age, I mean, is really the optimism. It's really, optimism has not been the feature of South Asia and South Asia's regional cooperation for a long time. The defining feature for a long time has been the least integrated region of the world, and the problems of even doing the smallest thing between neighbors in this part of the world. I mean, I think there are historical reasons for that, but I think what we do need to note is finally we're beginning to shift from the deep-rooted pessimism to optimism. I think that partly also happens if you look away from the West and look east. In the subcontinent, things are happening in the eastern subcontinent, which doesn't often get much publicity in Delhi. But I think what's happening in the eastern subcontinent is really that the potential, the possibilities for transcending our past. I think, Savya, you referred to partition in the morning, that the subcontinent was a single entity, politically, economically, and the partition of that subcontinent, political partition, need not have been followed by economic partition, but the economic partition was a choice that the South Asian states made. Look, I think often the young people there, I mean, I think you shouldn't forget that. The choices that we made on economic development, where trade was not important, import substitution was more important. Connectivity, for those young people sitting here, connectivity is a new word in the regional lexicon. Disconnectivity was the choice that we made as a deliberate I mean, it's not about to criticize the past, but the choices we made in 1947. We met our neighbors probably in New York more often, or in ADB or in other places than in our own neighborhood, because the economic strategy one was of inward orientation. Socialism in one country, if you will, build yourself, and that trade connectivity were not really central to the growth strategy. Subcontinent did enjoy open trade with Nepal and Bhutan, but still the choices in terms of trade policy itself were deliberate choices made, and those choices had consequences for regional economic integration. So what you had then, it was the consequence of some of the decisions, both the political partition as well as the economic partition, that produced a disconnected region. And I think what we've heard this morning is really a transition away from that. And there I would say much of that is really happening now in the eastern subcontinent, and I would say it's really fantastic to get there. But the ambition, quite clearly, what we heard this morning, is to restore the full connectivities that existed. We've heard this morning from our friends from Bangladesh and from the report as well. Many of the pre-partition connectivities in the east are being restored, and I think that's the way to go under new conditions, under new sovereignties. But I think the discovery that connectivity will actually benefit both people, that itself is a big leap from where we were before 1990. The second, the point I want to make is really how did we get here from there? I mean, from a choice of disconnectivity to one of actually how did we get to the connectivity? One, of course, was the choice of economic reform. That without an economic strategy that was focused on opening up, there was no chance one in hell for connectivity, because connectivity was really a consequence. Once you start valuing trade, once you start valuing, not import substitution but export promotion, then you come to a situation where actually you begin to think of connectivity. It's no shock or surprise that talks about SAFTA, all the other issues only happens in the 1990s because the nature of the economic orientation. And all countries did it in the region one by one. Today, most of us are in that process. But then you still had to overcome the political obstacles. So the choice of everyone was, was liberalizing, was globalizing, but the political problems of how do you deal with your neighbors remain. Here, I think that's where the transformation of the India-Bangladesh relationship over the last decade and more was really critical to realize what was possible in the eastern subcontinent. Till then, it was talk, it was on paper, but I think the emergence of Sheikh Hasina there in Bangladesh and in India, the government sat down and said, look, how do we break the old rigidities, old policies, and that's the reason why over the last decade and more, we have really transformed. But there's a political will today to do the kind of things that were considered impossible 15 years ago. Transit was a bad word in Dhaka. That access to ports was a bad word. Or today, this morning, what we heard from the Joint Secretary of letting Bangladesh export from air cargo from Indian airports. I mean, these were inconceivable because the politics did not permit this. And I think what we've seen happen really is the transformation of the India-Bangladesh relationship and the recognition that cooperation is mutually beneficial. And I think that provided a basis on which we've really moved. The other trigger, I would say, was really the Japanese leadership. It's often, we don't think of leadership when it comes to Japan because Japan was seen as shall we say, focused on, not in leading the region. I mean, but what we know from its practice is really when we talk about China and the Belt and Road. Japanese are not as good as in propaganda as the Chinese are, but it was really the Japanese who did the first corridors in Asia, in Southeast Asia. In fact, some of my Chinese friends told me that the Belt and Road initiative that was announced in 2013, the 10th anniversary, one of the inspiration for them was in 2005 when the Japanese Prime Minister came here and the idea of a Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor and a Delhi-Mumbai freight corridor. That the announcement of this, a new idea, we're still implementing it, that this provided a trigger for the Chinese to think in bolder terms and across borders as well. So the Japanese have been in the business of connectivity, of regional industrial corridors for almost 40, 50 years. The development of Southeast Asia, development of Mekong, the development of China, many of these, it was Japanese capital and Japanese economic ideas that actually led to the integration. So it's finally, they've come back into this region. And I think that is a big sign that the Japanese interest in this part of the world, because Japanese traditional focus was really on Southeast Asia, East Asia, and in fact many of the conceptions, South Asia was not really part of that conception. And that's why the Indo-Pacific idea, that for the first time a Japanese leadership that says India, South Asia are part of the conception of the Indo-Pacific, that the two oceans are similar, South Asia and East Asia are not separate spheres, that they're connected, and therefore we must think of this as an integrated zone. And that's why I think why the ambassador talked about the centrality of the Indo-Pacific vision, the free and open Indo-Pacific, in which the Japanese today are willing to invest a lot more to facilitate the integration of India, Bangladesh, through Japanese capital, through Japanese aid, through Japanese assistance, which is providing the leverage to actually get things done within the region. So I think that is something we need to clearly acknowledge. Finally, I would say, where do we go from here? I would say, in terms of the big ideas of connectivity, they're widely accepted. There is political acceptance for it. Barring in the northwestern subcontinent, the rest of the region, there is acceptance to it. We have money, we have capital. I mean, there is no shortage of money actually. The Japanese have money, and a whole number of international investors are willing to put their money into any project that generates more business. And the idea that that connectivity corridors can be developed across borders, that too is an accepted idea. But the challenge today is not at the big ideas level that I think many of us have talked about all these years, but today that's a reality. And the challenge today is really the nitty-gritty on the ground of getting things done. That's why you have this rest of the panel here. Each of them is involved in some form. So really the need to move things on the ground from a top level policy in Delhi to what actually happens on the ground. We've heard from the Joint Secretary that much has already happened. but I think a lot needs to be done because the legacy of a, the heavy hand of the Indian administrative state, the heavy hand of the Indian administrative state and our neighbors as well was focused on control, not on promotion. And I think dismantling that structure of the administrative state, of which was really long forgotten why we do things, to one of actually promotion. Things are happening in the East, but I think each time we do, there's some more things to be done. And a lot of these things can be done through executive action. It doesn't need a dramatic political decisions, like we just heard this morning, just letting Bangladesh use Indian airports to move. So I think there are, and I think that is the challenge, and there, the control to promotion, how we get that done, and there I think our role, like this Asian Confluence and others, we need on the ground to keep pushing the governments to keep moving forward, to pointing out the limitations, whether it's in trade facilitation, to non-tariff barriers, to keep, I think our job is really to ground level keep pushing that. And beyond that, I would say the title of this is Bay of Bengal. So as look south, as somebody said, we've talked about overland connectivity, but in the case of India, Bangladesh, this is quite central. But I think there is a deep ocean welcoming us out there, the Indo-Pacific and the Bay of Bengal. Here, I would say at some point we need to bring, Burma into this. That there are a huge number of problems at this stage, but I think eventually the Bay of Bengal won't be complete without getting the participation of Myanmar in this. I know that the Japanese have taken a number of initiatives. A lot of them in Tilawa, special industrial zone. Indians too invested in it there. So finding ways of bringing Burma back into this new economic zone is I think is quite critical. And we've already seen the Japanese talk about India-Japan Sri Lanka cooperation. So there is actually ways of extending it to other parts of South Asia. And then we've heard the Joint Secretary talk about India BIMSTEC, India Southeast Asia. So I think the idea of expanding it, broadening the scope, the more we do between India and Bangladesh, which is the core, then Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, Indian Ocean, and using the sea routes then to really further expand, and that's where the huge opportunity that we have. But I think, as I said, what we heard this morning, things can be changed, which is a big news, that, those who say, look, nothing can be changed, I think are fundamentally wrong. Change is the only law, and what we've seen is through activism, through conscious effort, we can change the way we do business in our neighborhood. And I would say this report and what is happening between India and Bangladesh and how Japan has helped move that forward, I think is very, very inspiring. And I leave it to the three fellow panelists to talk about the actual real stuff of how to get things done on the ground. Thank you.